Welcome, friends, to another edition of the Global Economic Brief. I'm glad you could join us today. Before we begin, a quick note for our regular viewers. Next Thursday, I'll be speaking at the Montreal Policy Forum about the future of North American trade. And the week after that, my new book, Sovereignty and Scarcity, will be released. It explores how nations are beginning to weaponize water the way they once weaponized oil. I hope you'll check it out. Now, let's turn to today's story, one that could define a generation of economic and political decisions. The title of our episode is When the Rivers Become Borders, the U.S.-Canada Water Standoff. We've heard a lot about tariffs, trade wars, and steel quotas over the past few years, but what's unfolding today reaches far deeper, literally into the veins of the continent itself. It's about water, about who owns it, who controls it, and who decides when it flows. The conflict began, as many do in Washington, with a speech and a promise. Former President Donald Trump, now once again a powerful voice in American politics, declared that Canada's rivers and lakes were key to America's survival. The line landed like thunder. At a moment when vast regions of the American Southwest, Arizona, Nevada, California, are choking under historic drought, Trump's statement was both a call to arms and a negotiation tactic. He framed it as a matter of national security. If America was to survive, he said, it needed Canada's water. Before we jump into the geopolitics, let's start with something simple. What are we really talking about here? The Columbia River, a 2,000-kilometer artery of fresh water that begins in the Canadian Rockies and winds its way south through the Pacific Northwest. Since 1961, its management has been governed by the Columbia River Treaty, a pact balancing Canada's hydroelectric potential with America's flood control needs. For decades, it worked quietly, efficiently, almost invisibly. It was the model of cooperation. But with one statement, Trump shattered that quiet. He suggested that the treaty's renewal should include something new: access to Canadian fresh water as a U.S. right, not a shared benefit. In other words, a deal that would turn a partnership into a pipeline. Ottawa's response was swift, uncharacteristically so. Prime Minister Mark Carney, once a central banker, not a fighter, stood before Parliament and said calmly, Canada's rivers are not for sale. The line drew applause at home and disbelief abroad, because for decades, Canada had been treated by investors, by industries, even by allies, as a reliable supplier of raw materials: lumber, oil, gas, and yes, water. This time, the answer was no. The reaction in Washington was immediate. Negotiations that had been paused for technical reasons now turned into political warfare. American commentators accused Ottawa of hoarding a continental resource. Conservative outlets framed Carney as weak, accusing him of endangering American farmers and manufacturing jobs. The irony, of course, is that those same industries had already been battered by the very trade wars Washington started tariffs on steel, lumber, and autos that backfired, raising prices and crippling supply chains. In other words, America's crisis of scarcity is not just natural, it's political, it's economic, it's self-inflicted. But we need to understand why this water issue cuts so deep. The United States is running out of water in its most productive regions. California's Central Valley, where 40% of America's vegetables and 2/3 of its fruits and nuts are grown, depends on irrigation from reservoirs that are now half empty. The Colorado River, lifeline for 40 million people, has been so overdrawn that entire states are rationing water like a wartime resource. In that setting, Trump's appeal to Canadian water sounds less like a foreign policy idea and more like desperation. Canada, for its part, is sitting atop 20% of the world's freshwater reserves. It is a hydrological superpower. But with that abundance comes vulnerability. Once a resource becomes essential to another nation's survival, it becomes a strategic target. Ottawa knows this. Environmental groups know it too, and that's why the backlash against Trump's declaration was immediate and fierce. Indigenous leaders from British Columbia to Manitoba warned that exporting water would violate treaty rights and destroy ecosystems. Economists cautioned that opening the door, even slightly, could transform lakes and rivers into commodities priced, traded, and speculated upon, just like oil futures. And that's the heart of it. The water dispute is not only about pipelines or treaties, it's about the logic of capitalism itself. The belief that everything, even life itself, can be bought and sold if the price is right. Trump, of course, framed it differently. He called it America First, a fight for survival against unfair neighbors. But let's not be fooled by slogans. Behind the rhetoric lies an economy that has mismanaged its own resources for decades, a system that drains aquifers for profit, then blames foreign nations when the wells run dry. The port of Churchill in northern Manitoba, once neglected and nearly abandoned, now stands as an unlikely symbol of this new reality. As trade tensions escalate, its Arctic access route offers Canada a way to bypass U.S. ports entirely, a corridor to Europe and Asia that cuts days off shipping times. The message is subtle but clear. Canada is learning to trade without depending on the United States. And that's what frightens Washington most. Because this isn't just a fight over water. It's a struggle over autonomy, over who gets to decide how nations survive in an age of scarcity. For the first time in modern history, Canada is asserting itself not as a junior partner, but as an equal power, one willing to say no. We'll explore what that means in the next segment economically, politically, and morally. But for now, remember this. When a nation that once supplied your abundance begins defending its own, that's not betrayal. That's evolution. Before we move forward, let's take a step back, because no confrontation like this happens overnight. Conflicts over resources always emerge from a deeper economic pattern, a structure that rewards short-term profit and punishes long-term planning. And the United States, for all its wealth, is a textbook case of that contradiction. For nearly a century, America's economy has been built on expansion of production, of consumption, and of confidence. It assumed that nature would keep up, that rivers would refill, that aquifers would recharge, and that the climate would remain steady enough to sustain this endless growth. But nature doesn't negotiate. It doesn't care about GDP forecasts. It follows its own balance sheet, one written in rainfall, temperature, and time. Now, with the climate shifting and droughts intensifying, that balance sheet is collapsing. In Arizona, reservoirs once so vast they looked infinite now resemble cracked bowls. In California, the snowpack that once fed rivers into the Central Valley melts weeks early, vanishing before crops can use it. And yet, amid all this, policy remains driven by ideology rather than evidence. Deregulation, privatization, and tax breaks for agribusiness continue as if the system were eternal. It isn't. That's what makes the demand for Canadian water so revealing. It's not just a plea for help. It's an economic confession. It admits implicitly that the American model of growth has reached its ecological limit. Rather than reform, the answer is extraction from somewhere else, from someone else. Now let's look north. Canada, long accustomed to playing the polite partner, suddenly finds itself holding leverage. It never expected. Water is now its strategic resource, its geopolitical goal. But that power comes with risk. The United States is not just any trading partner, it's the world's largest consumer market, Canada's neighbor, and its military ally. Defying Washington means more than diplomatic friction. It means economic retaliation, tariffs, trade barriers, threats, the tools of pressure that Trump wielded freely during his presidency. Mark Carney, a man whose career was forged in the quiet corridors of global finance, now faces a distinctly political test. Can a country of 40 million stand its ground against an empire of 330 million when that empire starts to thirst? His answer so far has been yes. But the cost is mounting. After Canada's refusal, U.S. states like California and Arizona scrambled to find alternatives. They looked inward: desalination plants, recycling systems, cloud seeding, all expensive, all years away. In the meantime, food production began to slip. A 10% reduction in water allocation translated to a 20% drop in yield. Almond orchards were left unharvested. Lettuce fields turned brown. Prices rose. The same consumers who once cheered America first now found themselves paying more for groceries produced with less water. That's the irony. The trade war, first about steel and lumber, now about water, has circled back to hit the very people it claimed to defend: workers and families. This is what economists call a feedback loop, but in human terms, it's simply consequence. Meanwhile, the markets reacted predictably. Investors hate uncertainty, and when the world's largest economy starts fighting over its most basic resource, confidence drains faster than a reservoir in July. Agricultural and manufacturing stocks wobbled. Companies reliant on steady water supply, semiconductors, chemicals, energy, began warning of disruptions. Even the defense industry, with its heavy water demands for cooling and materials processing, felt the tremor. Let's pause here. When defense manufacturers worry about water, you know the problem has crossed from environmental to existential. The U.S. government's response was to double down. Instead of negotiating with Ottawa, it threatened to review cross-border environmental agreements, including the Great Lakes Water Quality Accord, a pact that protects the drinking water of more than 40 million North Americans. It was a reckless gesture, one that sent shivers through cities like Detroit and Chicago, because destabilizing that accord would hurt Americans first, not Canadians. And yet, that's how empire behaves when challenged. It lashes out at the very systems that sustain it. History offers plenty of examples. In the 1,930 seconds, nations hoarded gold and raised tariffs in the name of self-preservation and plunged the world into depression. In the 1,970 seconds, the U.S. and its allies fought over oil supplies, each invoking energy independence, even as they deepened mutual dependence. Today, it's water. Different resource, same illusion. The truth is, no country is independent in the 21st century. Every economy is woven into the same ecological fabric. You can't tariff a river or sanction a drought. So what we're witnessing now is not simply a clash of nations. It's the collision between capitalism's demand for perpetual growth and the planet's finite limits. When Trump calls Canada's rivers the key to America's survival, he is perhaps unknowingly admitting that survival under this system can only continue by consuming someone else's abundance. That's not sovereignty. That's dependency with better branding. Let's begin with a simple observation. Scarcity breeds opportunity, but also fear. The moment one nation faces shortage, another sees a market. That's the paradox driving our new geopolitics of water. And Canada, almost unintentionally, has become its focal point. When Trump's demand for Canadian rivers went unanswered, other powers took note. Beijing, never one to waste a strategic opening, began quietly advancing its own version of water diplomacy. Chinese firms, state-backed but privately dressed, approached Canadian infrastructure companies with proposals that sounded harmless enough. Joint ventures in reservoir technology, flood management systems, pipeline maintenance, but behind the language of cooperation lay a familiar logic: investment today for access tomorrow. That's how resource politics has always worked. You don't seize the well by force. You buy the company that owns the pumps. You don't claim the lake. You fund the logistics that make it flow. By 2025, estimates suggest Chinese capital has already seeped into more than a dozen Canadian hydrology projects, from Manitoba to Quebec. None of them large enough to trigger alarms individually, but together they form a pattern. China understands that in a century defined by climate shocks, whoever controls water infrastructure controls resilience. Europe, too, is watching. Southern regions like Spain, Italy, and Greece have endured the worst droughts in recorded history. Crops that once fed millions are shriveling. Brussels, which used to debate agricultural subsidies, now debates survival strategies, and in those conversations, Canada's freshwater reserves are beginning to appear in the fine print. Long-term import frameworks, emergency exchange programs, even academic cooperation platforms, all polite ways of saying, we may one day need your water. So what we're witnessing is not just a North American standoff, but the opening act of a global scramble. The same way the 20th century revolved around oil cartels and energy alliances, the 21st will revolve around what some economists are already calling the hydropolitical order. In this new order, Canada holds what Saudi Arabia once held, an indispensable resource, mostly stable politics, and a geographic monopoly. Let's not romanticize that position. Resource power is seductive but dangerous. History shows it can transform a cooperative nation into a fortress, admired and resented in equal measure. Mark Carney understands this tension well. As a former governor of both the Bank of Canada and the Bank of England, he's seen how financial markets treat scarcity not as a warning, but as profit potential. Already, derivatives tied to water futures are trading on Wall Street. Investors bet on drought the way they once bet on oil prices. It's speculation disguised as necessity. And so the question becomes, how long before water itself becomes a formal commodity in Canada? For now, the government insists it will not happen. But markets have a way of eroding moral barriers. First come pilot projects, then export partnerships, then strategic resource adjustments. The vocabulary of compromise expands until the principle disappears. Trump's demand, in that sense, did not end with his presidency. It opened the door for something larger, the global financialization of freshwater. If you can trade emissions and carbon credits, why not cubic meters of clean water? That's the logic creeping into boardrooms today. And it's precisely what makes Canada's resistance so important. Because beneath the politics lies an ethical divide. Do we treat water as a shared human right or as another asset class? The answer will determine more than trade balances. It will decide the moral direction of the global economy. Now, consider what happens when water security merges with national defense. In the United States, the Pentagon has already designated climate-related shortages as threat multipliers. That bureaucratic term means water scarcity can trigger migration, conflict, even war. When Trump reframed Canadian rivers as a survival issue, he effectively recast a resource dispute as a security crisis. The implication is unsettling. If water becomes a matter of national defense, then diplomacy becomes secondary. That's how economic desperation morphs into geopolitical risk. Not overnight, but drip by drip. First, a treaty renegotiation. Then, tariffs on hydropower exports. Then, perhaps, a proposal for joint water management zones. Each step sounds administrative until it isn't. We've seen this play before with oil. In the 1,970 seconds, the OPEC embargo turned pipelines into political weapons and reshaped alliances overnight. The nations that had been suppliers became strategists. The nations that had been customers became vulnerable. Today's water politics follows the same script, only with higher stakes. You can substitute oil, you can't substitute water. And this brings us to the deeper economic lesson. Capitalism in its current form thrives on scarcity. The rarer the resource, the higher the profit. But when scarcity extends to the essentials of life, air, water, soil, the system reaches a point of moral absurdity. You can't privatize survival indefinitely. Eventually, people push back. That's what we're beginning to see in Canada, a quiet rebellion against the commodification of existence. Still, rebellion doesn't guarantee resolution. The U.S. continues to pressure Ottawa through trade channels, hinting that cooperation on energy exports or defense procurement might depend on flexibility over water. Diplomats call this linkage. Economists call it leverage. Citizens might call it what it is, blackmail. Before moving on, it's worth asking, what happens when a superpower accustomed to abundance must finally live within its limits? The United States has never been forced to imagine itself as resource poor, but drought is rewriting that self-image. And as every empire learns, when abundance turns to scarcity, power itself begins to evaporate. Let's now turn to the political heart of this crisis sovereignty in the age of scarcity. Because when nations run short on resources, the question isn't just what do we have, it's who decides how we use it. The American vision, at least under Trump, is that strength equals entitlement. If a nation is powerful enough, its needs become its rights. That's the unspoken logic behind his demand for Canada's rivers. It's the same logic that once justified oil wars and before that colonial expansion. Yet in this moment, it feels strangely fragile because water doesn't obey borders and power doesn't create rainfall. When Trump described Canada's fresh water as a vast supply waiting to be tapped, he framed geography as destiny, that what lies north must serve what lies south. Ottawa's refusal, therefore, wasn't just an act of environmental protection. It was a political revolution, a smaller neighbor telling a superpower, your need is not my obligation. Let's pause on that. For decades, U.S. policy toward Canada rested on quiet assumptions that cooperation was automatic, that trade would always flow, that disputes could be settled through polite compromise. But those assumptions belong to another era, one where both nations enjoyed abundance. Now, the relationship is being redefined not by goodwill, but by necessity. and necessity is never polite. Prime Minister Mark Carney's government faces the most difficult balancing act in modern Canadian history. On one side, public opinion is fiercely defensive. Polls show more than 80% of Canadians oppose any export of bulk fresh water. On the other, powerful domestic interests, agribusiness, mining, energy, see opportunity in global demand. Behind the curtain, they're already lobbying for pilot exchanges that could test the political limits of resistance. Carney, the economist turned statesman, knows the danger of giving an inch. Once water is priced, it ceases to be a right. It becomes inventory. Meanwhile, the human consequences of this standoff are spreading far beyond boardrooms. In the American West, farmers now face crop failures at a scale unseen since the Dust Bowl. Tens of thousands of jobs have vanished in California's Central Valley. The region's economy, once worth more than $30 billion a year, has lost nearly a quarter of its output. And while Washington blames Ottawa, the truth is more complex. Decades of over-extraction, industrial farming, and climate neglect created this drought long before any Canadian decision. Yet politically, it's always easier to point north than inward. This is how populism feeds on crisis. Trump's speeches now portray Canada not as an ally, but as a gatekeeper, hoarding a treasure the U.S. deserves. The narrative resonates because scarcity fuels resentment, and resentment needs an enemy. They have it, we need it, it's a simple story, and in politics, simple stories win. But here's the danger. When scarcity becomes ideology, democracy begins to erode. Citizens are told that national survival requires obedience, that questioning policy equals weakness, that security justifies any compromise. We've seen this pattern before in wartime economies, in authoritarian states, even in corporate boardrooms. It's the politics of emergency, permanent and profitable. Canada is not immune either. The same fear that drives U.S. nationalism could harden Canada's own politics. Already, debates over water exports have revived old divisions between provinces. British Columbia defending its rivers, Alberta eyeing pipelines, Quebec invoking constitutional rights over its hydroelectric system. The struggle for national unity, once defined by language or energy, may soon hinge on water. And Carney knows that if Ottawa mishandles this, Canada's federation itself could fracture under regional pressure. Now step back and look at the broader pattern. Across the globe, water scarcity is becoming the fault line of democracy. In the Middle East, the Euphrates divides farmers from governments. In South Asia, the Brahmaputra pits upstream nations against downstream survival. Everywhere the same dilemma emerges. How do you share what no longer seems shareable? Economists call it the tragedy of the commons. Political scientists call it sovereignty under stress. But ordinary citizens simply call it unfair. Because in a world where billions face water insecurity, watching rich nations argue over who owns abundance feels obscene. And yet, there is another layer here, one that's easy to overlook. For all its nationalist theatrics, Trump's argument accidentally exposes a real truth. Water is destiny. The nations that control it will define the next century. Whether through agriculture, industry, or migration, every political decision will trace back to where the rivers run and who guards their sources. That's not ideology, that's hydrology. But here's what history tells us. Every time humanity turns a shared resource into a weapon, it loses twice. Once in trust and again in stability. The U.S. and Canada spent 60 years building one of the most peaceful borders in the world. a line marked not by walls, but by treaties and trade. Now, that border risks becoming a front line, and not because of armies or ideology, but because of water, the most basic element of life. So where does this lead? If Trump's rhetoric continues, if American droughts deepen, if markets keep pricing scarcity, the temptation for escalation will grow, not necessarily through conflict, but through control of infrastructure, of investment, of diplomacy. And when control becomes the goal, democracy shrinks. Before we conclude, let's return to the beginning, not to Trump's speeches or Carney's defiance, but to the deeper question that shadows them both. What happens when survival becomes an economic category? Because that's what this conflict is really about. Not just trade, not just rivers, but the moment when a system built on profit encounters a resource that cannot be replaced. Water exposes capitalism's oldest illusion of the belief that everything has a price. For decades, economists were trained to treat scarcity as opportunity. When something becomes rare, its value rises, incentives emerge, and innovation follows. It's the comforting cycle of the market. But water doesn't obey that script. Raise the price high enough and people still need to drink. That's not elasticity, that's existence. And this is where we begin to see the moral bankruptcy of the current model. When Trump demanded Canada's rivers in the name of American survival, he was echoing the logic of a system that sees nature not as a partner, but as a warehouse, a place to withdraw from endlessly until the shelves are bare. He didn't invent that mindset. He merely said aloud what global capitalism has long practiced in silence. Canada's refusal then wasn't just about sovereignty. It was about sanity. It was the rare moment when a nation said no to the idea that survival can be negotiated. In doing so, it forced the world to confront an uncomfortable truth. We've built an economy that measures success by depletion. The more we consume, the more we call it growth. The faster we exhaust, the more we celebrate efficiency. And when the resource runs out, we blame those who still have it. But markets don't restore rivers. They only assign ownership to what's left. That's why the moral question matters now more than ever. Are we willing to accept a future where the right to water depends on the right to profit, where sovereignty means hoarding rather than stewardship? Or can we imagine a world where cooperation replaces coercion, not as idealism, but as necessity? In the end, the U.S.-Canada water standoff isn't just a bilateral issue. It's a mirror held up to all of us. It reflects how nations behave when the illusion of abundance ends. It shows whether democracy can still function when survival is at stake. And it reminds us that the greatest threat to civilization is not drought or flood, but the belief that we can out-negotiate nature. So what does this teach us? That the real scarcity isn't water, it's wisdom. The capacity to plan beyond election cycles, to govern for the planet rather than the quarter, to see cooperation not as weakness, but as strength. The challenge before us is not technological, it's philosophical. It's about redefining prosperity in a world where the most valuable resource cannot be manufactured, mined, or monetized, only shared. The story of the Columbia River, of Churchill's port, of two nations testing the boundaries of friendship, will be remembered not for who won, but for what it revealed. That sovereignty in the 21st century is not about domination, but restraint. Not about how much a country can take, but how much it dares to protect. Thank you for joining us for this week's edition of the Global Economic Brief. As always, I look forward to speaking with you again next week as we continue to explore how economics shapes our world and how together we might still shape it back.